In 1423, in the German village of Schwarzwald, 8-year-old Henrik was given a gift by his mother. A bright red hood, carefully sewn from expensive fabric his family could barely afford. He smiled when she placed it on his head. 3 days later, he was dead in the forest, his small body torn apart by wolves. This wasn't a tragic accident. This was the Waldprobe, the forest trial. For over 2 centuries, villages across the Germanic territories practiced something they called correction through nature. Children who were deemed problematic, disobedient, strange, or simply unwanted were subjected to this ritual. The community would gather, the local priest would offer prayers, and the child would be sent into the forest alone, with a basket of food and that red hood. The official explanation was rehabilitation. The child would spend time alone in nature, reflect on their behavior, and return reformed. Parents were told their children would be watched over by God. Village elders assured families this was an ancient tradition of spiritual cleansing. But here's what they didn't say out loud. Everyone knew most of these children never came back. The red hood wasn't protection. It was a marker. In dense medieval forests where visibility was limited, that bright red fabric served one purpose: to make the child visible, not to rescuers, to predators. Wolves could spot that red from hundreds of meters away. So could the exiled criminals who lived in those woods, the ones who had been banned from society for theft, violence, and worse. They knew about the Waldprobe. They waited for it. Church records from the period are chilling in their bureaucratic coldness. Lists of children sent for forest correction, with notes beside their names. Returned after 8 days, improved behavior. Those were rare. Most entries simply said, remained with God, or accepted by the forest. Medieval speak for we never saw them again. Parents had no choice in this. If the village council decided your child needed the Waldprobe, you complied. Refusing meant your entire family could be exiled, or worse. Some records show parents who protested were accused of harboring evil in their homes. In an era of witch hunts and religious paranoia, that accusation was a death sentence. The baskets these children carried were filled with just enough food for 3 days, sometimes less. The message was clear. This wasn't about survival training. This was about making sure the child stayed in one place long enough for nature or something else to find them. But wait, it gets worse. The ritual had another layer that most families only discovered too late. The red hood was specially treated, soaked in animal blood and fat before being dyed. This wasn't for waterproofing or durability. It was to create a scent marker. Predators could smell those children from miles away. Village blacksmiths, the ones who prepared these hoods, knew exactly what they were doing. Some of their private journals have survived. One blacksmith from 1445 wrote in his diary that he hated preparation days and begged God for forgiveness. But he kept doing it, because refusing meant joining the children in the forest. The Waldprobe claimed hundreds, possibly thousands of children between 1380 and 1520. Small bodies that disappeared into the German wilderness, their families left to mourn while pretending their child was simply taking longer to find redemption. Henrik's mother kept his red hood for the rest of her life. Records show she went mad within a year, talking to the empty hood as if her son was still wearing it. She died in 1426, clutching that red fabric. The village priest noted in his records that she had succumbed to excessive maternal grief, a weakness of female constitution. The real horror wasn't just the deaths, it was the systematic participation. Entire communities collaborating in the murder of their own children, hiding behind ritual and religion, pretending this was correction when everyone knew it was execution. And the worst part? The practice was about to reveal something even darker about what mothers were forced to do. The Waldprobe didn't start the day a child entered the forest. It started 5 days before, with something called Die Vorbereitung, the preparation. On the first day, the child was moved from their family home to a small stone building at the village edge. This structure existed in every community that practiced the Waldprobe. It was called the Reinigungshaus, the cleansing house. Windows were barred. The door was locked from outside. Inside, the child received 1 meal per day, watered-down soup with barely any substance. The official explanation was spiritual purification through fasting. The real reason was more practical and infinitely crueler. A hungry child moves slower, makes more mistakes, becomes easier prey. During these 5 days, the child was visited once per day by the village priest. He would conduct confession sessions, where the child had to recount every sin, every act of disobedience, every impure thought. These sessions could last hours. Children as young as 6 were interrogated about moral failures they couldn't possibly understand. Some priests kept detailed records of these confessions. One surviving document from 1467, found in a Bavarian monastery, contains confessions from 12 children who underwent Waldprobe that year. The priest noted their fear, their confusion, their desperate promises to be better if they could just go home. Then, beside each name, a date. The day they entered the forest, and beside that, a single word. Verschwunden, disappeared. But the psychological torture was only part of the preparation. On the 3rd day, the child received the red hood. This wasn't a simple clothing exchange, it was a ceremony. The entire village gathered in the church. The child, weak from hunger and isolation, was brought before the congregation. The priest would place the red hood on their head while reciting prayers about redemption and God's judgment. The child's parents were required to stand and publicly affirm their support for this correction. Imagine being that parent, standing in front of everyone you knew, watching your child being marked for death, and having to smile and nod and thank the priest for this opportunity for your child's soul to be saved. Historical accounts mention several parents who broke down during these ceremonies. They were removed from the church and later fined for disrupting sacred proceedings. After the hooding ceremony, something truly twisted happened. The community held a feast, a celebration. Tables were set up in the village square with food and wine. Music was played. Children who weren't being sent to the forest played games. Meanwhile, the child in the red hood sat alone at a separate small table. They were given slightly more food than they'd received in previous days, but they ate while everyone else celebrated. This was called the Abschiedsmahl, the farewell meal. The psychological message was clear. Your removal is so beneficial to this community that we're celebrating it while you sit here alone. One account from 1491 describes a 10-year-old girl named Elsa who was undergoing Waldprobe. During the feast, she approached her mother and asked why everyone was happy. Her mother, required by custom to participate in the celebration, told her it was because God was giving her a special opportunity. Elsa asked if she could share her mother's food instead of sitting alone. Her mother had to say no. That was the last conversation they ever had. On the 4th day, the child's head was shaved, completely, boys and girls both. The official reason was hygiene. The actual reason? Humiliation and identification. If a child somehow escaped the forest and tried to blend into another village, that shaved head marked them. Everyone would know what they were. Some villages added another element. They would paint symbols on the child's shaved head, using a mixture that wouldn't wash off for weeks. Crosses, circles, sometimes words like unworthy. By the 5th day, the child in the cleansing house was physically weakened, psychologically devastated, marked, humiliated, and completely isolated. They had been transformed from a community member into something else, something disposable. The night before departure, the child's mother was required to visit the cleansing house one final time. This wasn't compassion. This was the cruelest part of the entire ritual. She had to help her child pack the basket for the forest. She had to fold the clothes her child would wear. She had to look into her child's eyes and tell them everything would be fine. And she had to do this knowing she was preparing her own child for death. Records indicate that many mothers tried to sneak extra food into the baskets, Church officials specifically watched for this and would remove any additional supplies. The portions were calculated precisely. 3 days of minimal sustenance. Enough to keep the child alive long enough to reach the deep forest. Not enough to survive beyond that. Some mothers wrote letters and hid them in the baskets. Dozens of these letters have been found over the centuries, buried in forest soil alongside small skeletons. They all say essentially the same thing: desperate apologies, expressions of love, prayers for forgiveness. One letter, found in 1823 near Freiburg, was written by a mother named Margaret in 1478. It simply said, "Forgive me, forgive me, forgive me," written 47 times until the page ran out. After packing the basket, the mother had to leave. No goodbye, no embrace. The Waldprobe rules were explicit. Emotional attachment would weaken the child's spirit and make the correction less effective. She walked out of the cleansing house without looking back. That night, the child slept alone on a wooden floor with a thin blanket. Tomorrow, they would begin walking, and their mother would be forced to participate in one more act of cruelty that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Dawn broke on the 6th day. The child was removed from the cleansing house and brought to the village edge where the forest path began. A small crowd always gathered for departures. This wasn't support. This was witnessing, making sure the ritual was completed properly. The child wore the red hood, carried the basket, and stood waiting. Waiting for the person who would walk them to their death. Their mother. The Beglite gang. The accompanying walk. This was the rule that broke women's minds for the rest of their lives. The mother had to walk with her child into the forest, not just to the forest edge, deep into it, for hours, until they reached a specific marker, usually a particular type of tree or rock formation that the village elders had designated as the point of separation. This was typically 5 to 8 miles from the village, far enough that the child couldn't easily find their way back, deep enough that the forest became genuinely dangerous. During this walk, the mother was forbidden from speaking. Complete silence. The child could talk, could cry, could beg. The mother had to remain mute. This rule was enforced because village representatives sometimes followed at a distance to ensure compliance. One recorded case from 1456 describes a mother named Hilda who spoke to her son during the walk, trying to comfort him. She was reported. Upon returning to the village, she was publicly whipped and fined half her family's yearly income. Imagine walking for hours with your terrified child, hearing them ask why this is happening, hearing them promise to be better, hearing them say they love you, and being unable to respond, not even able to hold their hand, because physical contact was also forbidden. The mother walked ahead. The child followed. In complete silence except for the child's voice, growing more desperate with each mile. Some children stopped talking after the first hour, realizing their mother wouldn't respond. They just walked in traumatized silence. Others talked the entire way, creating one-sided conversations that their mothers would replay in their minds until they died. "Mama, are you angry with me? Mama, will you come get me tomorrow? Mama, I'm scared. Mama, please look at me." Records mention mothers who went completely deaf in one ear. Psychosomatic deafness. Their minds protecting them from memories of their children's voices during that walk. Others developed what was called Waldstille, forest silence. They stopped speaking altogether after the ritual. Some never spoke again. When they reached the separation point, the mother had one final task. She had to take the basket from her child and place it on the ground. Then she had to take 3 steps backward, then 3 more, then turn around and walk away. The child was instructed to count to 100 before touching the basket. This gave the mother time to get distance. The child stood there, alone, counting out loud in the forest, their voice getting shakier with each number, while their mother walked away listening to that counting fade behind her. Here's the part that reveals the true sadism of this system. The mother was forbidden from looking back, not once. If she looked back, even a glance, she was considered to have failed the ritual. Her child would be retrieved, and the entire process would start over. 5 more days of preparation, another walk. But this time, if the mother looked back again, she would be exiled from the village, or executed for refusing to comply with sacred tradition. Village elders knew human nature. They knew mothers would be tempted to look back. So they posted watchers, men who hid along the return path specifically to catch mothers who turned around. It was a trap built into the ritual. A court document from 1489 details the trial of a woman named Berta who looked back during her daughter's Begleitgang. She was caught by a watcher and brought before the village council. She begged them to let her daughter come home, saying she'd been wrong to question the council's judgment. They denied her appeal. Her daughter was retrieved from the forest, kept in the cleansing house for another 5 days, and sent back out. This time, Berta walked the path correctly. She didn't look back. Her daughter's remains were found 6 months later by hunters. Some mothers developed elaborate coping mechanisms. They would recite prayers loudly during the entire return walk to drown out any sounds from behind them. Others would press their hands against their eyes, physically preventing themselves from turning. One account describes a mother who had her sister walk behind her during the return, physically holding her head forward. The return walk was where many women broke completely. Alone on that forest path, having just abandoned their child, they would collapse. Some never made it back to the village. Search parties would find them days later, dead from exposure or dehydration, or sometimes from self-inflicted wounds. These deaths were recorded in church books as overcome by weakness during sacred duty. Those who made it back faced a community that pretended everything was normal. There was no mourning period because officially the child wasn't dead. They were undergoing correction. The mother was expected to resume her regular duties immediately. Cook dinner, tend the garden, smile at neighbors, act as if she hadn't just walked her child to their death. Other children in the family would ask where their sibling was. The mother had to explain they were with God or learning to be better. Small children don't understand euphemisms. They would ask when their brother or sister was coming home. Every day, for weeks, months, the mother had to keep lying. Some women were pregnant during their child's Wald probe. Imagine carrying a new life while abandoning another. Several records mention women who miscarried within days of completing the Begleitgang. Village priests attributed this to weak constitutions unsuitable for motherhood. Modern analysis suggests profound psychological trauma. The community maintained a list called the Wald Register, the Forest Register. It tracked every child sent for correction, the date they left, and whether they returned. This document was kept in the church, and families could request to see it. Some mothers visited regularly, checking to see if their child's name had been marked as returned. Most names never were. A particularly disturbing entry from 1501 shows a mother named Agneta who visited the Wald Register every single day for 4 years after her son's Wald probe. The priest finally wrote in his journal that he'd stopped allowing her to view the register because her daily visits were disrupting church peace. But here's what none of these mothers knew during their walk. What was actually waiting for their children in those forests wasn't nature's judgment. It was something far more deliberate and far more human. The forests of medieval Germany weren't empty wilderness. They were inhabited. And the inhabitants knew all about the Wald probe. Criminals in medieval Germanic territories faced harsh punishments for serious offenses. Exile was common. But exile didn't mean being escorted to a border and told to leave. It meant being taken into the deep forest, stripped of supplies, and abandoned. The German term was friedlos, peaceless. You existed outside the protection of law. These exiled men didn't die quietly in the woods. They survived. They built crude shelters. They hunted, stole from traveling merchants, and raided village outskirts at night. And they developed networks, friedlos communities, outlaw camps hidden in the densest parts of the forest. By the 1400s, some of these camps had been established for generations. Fathers taught sons how to survive in exile. These weren't temporary hideouts. They were permanent settlements built on crime and desperation. And they knew exactly when Waldprobe season was. Villages typically conducted the ritual during specific times of year. Late summer and early autumn were most common, after harvest when communities had evaluated which families could sustain their children through winter and which could not. The Friedlos learned these patterns. They watched the villages. They knew which ones practiced Waldprobe. They knew the traditional separation points where mothers left children. And they knew what a child in a red hood meant. Fresh victim. A discovered cache of belongings from a Friedlos camp in 1518 contained dozens of red hoods. Dozens, each one carefully stored. These weren't trophies in the traditional sense. They were work materials. The Friedlos would take the hoods off dead children and use them to mark new hunting grounds, hanging them from trees like grotesque signposts. But death wasn't always immediate. Some of these men kept children alive, not out of mercy, for labor. Small hands were useful for certain tasks. Children could be sent into narrow spaces to retrieve items. They could be taught to steal from villages because a child wandering alone drew less suspicion than a grown man. A legal document from 1492 records the testimony of a man named Georg, who had been Friedlos for 8 years. He was captured during a raid and agreed to testify in exchange for a quick execution instead of torture. His testimony describes how his camp had collected 11 children over 3 years from various Waldprobe rituals. He described how they kept the children in a pit covered with branches, how they fed them barely enough to survive, how they used them to scout villages and carry stolen goods. When authorities asked what happened to those 11 children, Georg said 9 had died from sickness or injury. The other 2 had been killed when they became too old to be useful. He led authorities to the pit. They found remains. The church ordered everything burned and the site consecrated. No official count of remains was recorded. Georg also revealed something that horrified the court. Some Friedlos camps had developed a trade relationship with certain villages. They would wait near Waldprobe separation points, collect the children, and sell them to other criminal networks farther away. Child trafficking masked as natural selection. He described how they could tell which children would last longest based on how the mothers acted during separation. If a mother lingered even slightly, took those backward steps slowly, the child was typically stronger-willed and harder to break. If the mother rushed away, the child would be more compliant. The Friedlos had turned observation of maternal trauma into a selection system. The testimony was so disturbing that the judge ordered it sealed. It remained in archives until discovered by researchers in 1867. By then, Waldprobe had been illegal for over 300 years, but the document provided evidence of what many had suspected. The ritual wasn't just cruel negligence. It was feeding children into a known predator system. But human predators weren't the only threat. Real wolves were abundant in medieval German forests, and they learned, just like the Friedlos, that red meant food. Wolf behavior experts who've studied medieval hunting records note something unusual. In regions where Waldprobe was practiced, wolf attacks on humans were significantly more common. Wolves are typically cautious around humans, but in these areas, they became bolder. Why? Because for generations, they'd been conditioned that small humans in red meant easy prey. The wolves literally learned to hunt children based on the ritual. They would see red, associate it with vulnerable prey that wouldn't fight back effectively, and attack. This created a feedback loop. More children sent into forests, more successful wolf hunts, wolves becoming more aggressive toward humans, villages blaming demonic possession or curses, sending more children for spiritual correction. One wolf den discovered in 1509 near Freiburg contained the remains of at least 6 children, identified by scraps of red fabric and small bones. The hunters who found it reported that the wolves seemed to have been bringing bodies back to feed their young, a behavior typically associated with wolf packs that had found a reliable food source. The church received reports about these findings, about the Friedlos camps, about the pattern of child remains. Some local priests began questioning whether Waldprobe was morally justified, but higher church authorities responded with a document that still exists in Vatican archives. It essentially states that the deaths were proof that these children harbored evil, which attracted evil to them. Therefore, the ritual was working as intended. The wicked were being separated from the righteous. This rationalization allowed Waldprobe to continue for another generation. Villages kept sending children. Mothers kept walking them into the forest. And both human and animal predators kept waiting. One surviving letter from 1503, written by a village elder named Otto, describes his growing horror at the system. He wrote to a bishop questioning the morality of a practice that feeds our children to wolves and worse. The bishop's response was brief. God's judgment takes many forms. Do not question what you cannot understand. Otto's letter included a chilling observation. He noted that in the 3 years he'd been tracking Waldprobe in his region, 42 children had been sent into the forest. Not one had returned. Not one. Yet the practice continued because each village could pretend their case was unique, their child's corruption was special, their need was justified. The statistical reality was clear. Waldprobe was execution. But as long as the execution happened out of sight, hidden in the forest, disguised as divine judgment, communities could maintain the pretense of civilization. And when a child did occasionally survive and find their way back, that's when the true depths of this system's cruelty became apparent. In 1486, a girl named Greta von Eisenwald did the impossible. She survived. Greta was 10 years old when her village council decided she needed correction. Her crime was speaking during church services. 3 times she'd been caught whispering to her younger brother during Mass. The priest reported her to the elders. They voted unanimously. Waldprobe. Her mother walked her into the forest on September 3rd, left her at the separation point, walked away without looking back, just as required. Greta stood there with her basket, her red hood and her shaved head marked with a black cross. She counted to 100 like she'd been instructed. Then she was alone. For 3 days, she stayed near the separation point, eating her meager rations slowly, hoping her mother would come back. She didn't understand. That wasn't how it worked. On the 4th day, with her food gone, she started walking. Not deeper into the forest. Back toward home. She walked for 2 days. A 10-year-old child, starving, alone, navigating by memory and luck. She drank from streams, ate berries that made her vomit, slept in hollow trees. On the 6th day, she stumbled out of the forest edge near her village. A farmer saw her first. He ran to get the village elder. Within an hour, everyone knew. The girl in the red hood had returned. This should have been celebrated. A miracle. Proof of God's mercy. A child redeemed and restored to her family. But that's not what happened. Greta's return created a problem. The entire Waldprobe system was built on a simple assumption. Children didn't come back. Their absence was proof of God's judgment. Their disappearance confirmed they'd needed correction. The ritual worked because it was final. A child returning broke that logic. If Greta survived, what did that mean about all the other children who hadn't? If she could walk back, why couldn't they? Her survival asked questions the community couldn't afford to answer. The village council met in emergency session that same day. Greta was taken to the cleansing house, the same building where she'd spent 5 days before her walk. She wasn't allowed to see her mother. She sat alone while men in the next room decided her fate. The meeting minutes survive. They're kept in a regional archive in Baden-Württemberg. The discussion was remarkably practical. No emotional debate, just logistics. The council identified their problem clearly. Greta's return undermined the entire system. If word spread that a child could survive and come home, other families might resist future Waldprobe judgments. Parents might help their children return. The whole structure could collapse. Their solution was equally practical. Greta couldn't be allowed to stay, but sending her back to the forest immediately would look suspicious. They needed a different approach. They needed her removal to seem justified by something else. something the community would accept without question: witchcraft. On September 12th, 9 days after Greta emerged from the forest, the village priest made an announcement during Mass. Greta von Eisenwald had returned from correction, but she had returned wrong, changed, possessed. Her survival proved she'd made a pact with forest demons. The proof? She'd lived when righteous children did not. The logic was perfect in its circularity. Good children died because they were being purified. This child lived, therefore she must be evil. Her survival was evidence of her corruption. Greta's mother tried to intervene. She stood up during the announcement and said her daughter was fine, was normal, was still the same girl. The priest responded by asking how she could know that. Had she not abandoned the child as required? Had she looked back during the walk? Was she, perhaps, also compromised? The mother sat down. She never spoke in her daughter's defense again. Fear silenced her just as effectively as the Beglite gang rules had. Greta was moved from the cleansing house to a cell beneath the church. For 2 weeks, she was examined for signs of demonic influence. This examination consisted of interrogation, sleep deprivation, and eventually torture. They needed a confession. They needed her to admit she'd made a pact with evil forces. A 10-year-old child, who'd just survived 6 days alone in a forest, was now being tortured in a church basement. The priest conducting the examination kept detailed notes. They still exist. He recorded how many hours she went without sleep, how many times she was struck, what questions were asked, what answers she gave. For the first week, she maintained her innocence. She said she'd just walked home. She'd been scared. She'd wanted her mother. The priest noted that her resistance to confession was further proof of demonic influence. A truly pure child would have confessed immediately. On the 11th day of examination, Greta broke. She confessed. She said she'd met a man in the forest who gave her food in exchange for her soul. She said he had the head of a wolf. She said he promised to help her get revenge on everyone who'd hurt her. The priest wrote down every word. Finally, he had what he needed. The trial was held on September 28th. Public. Mandatory attendance for all villagers. Greta was brought out in chains. Her head had been shaved again. Her feet were bare and bleeding. She could barely stand. The priest read her confession aloud. He added embellishments, claims that she'd admitted to cursing the village crops, to poisoning a well, to planning to kill other children. None of this was in the original confession notes, but nobody questioned it. The crowd was already convinced. Her mother sat in the front row. Records indicate she was required to attend, required to watch. When the priest finished reading the charges and asked if anyone spoke in the child's defense, her mother stayed silent. What could she say? Speaking up would mean sharing her daughter's fate. The verdict was unanimous. Guilty of witchcraft and demonic conspiracy. The sentence was death by fire, immediate execution. No appeals. No mercy. Greta was 10 years old. They burned her the next morning in the village square. The entire community watched. Children were brought to witness what happened to those who made pacts with evil. The fire was built slowly, carefully, to ensure maximum suffering. This wasn't just execution. It was a message. Greta screamed for her mother as the flames rose. Her mother, standing in the crowd, covered her ears and closed her eyes. She was seen. People noted her weakness. Some whispered that perhaps the whole family was tainted. The burning lasted approximately 40 minutes before Greta stopped moving. Her body was left hanging from the stake for 3 days as a warning. Then it was taken down, ground into ash, and scattered in the forest. The same forest she'd walked out of. The same forest that was supposed to have kept her. The church recorded her death as successful purification of demonic corruption. Her name was removed from the family records. Her mother never spoke of her again. A year later, her mother died. The cause was listed as melancholia of the blood, but neighbors said she'd simply stopped eating. Greta's execution served its purpose perfectly. For the next 30 years in that region, no child who underwent Waldprobe ever tried to return. Even if they survived in the forest, even if they found their way back, they stayed away. They'd learned what happened to children who came home. But Greta's story didn't end with her death. During her trial, something had happened that the village council didn't anticipate. The visiting judge from a neighboring territory had attended. He'd watched the proceedings. He'd read the examination notes. And he'd started asking questions. Those questions would eventually unravel everything. The judge's name was Heinrich Kramer, and he wasn't investigating witchcraft. He was investigating the church's finances. Boring administrative work. He'd been sent to audit several parishes, checking tax records and property claims. Greta's trial happened to occur during his visit. Kramer wasn't a reformer. He wasn't particularly compassionate. He was a bureaucrat who liked numbers to make sense. And something about Greta's case bothered him from an accounting perspective. The village had held 47 Waldprobe rituals in the past 12 years. That was an unusually high number. It meant a lot of confiscated property, because when a child was sent for correction and didn't return, their inheritance reverted to the church. He started looking at the money, following the property transfers, tracking which families had been targeted. A pattern emerged. Wealthy families with few heirs, families with large land holdings, families who'd recently inherited assets. The children being sent for correction weren't just the disobedient ones. They were the ones whose deaths would profit the church most. Kramer expanded his investigation to neighboring villages. Same pattern. Children from wealthy families underwent Waldprobe at much higher rates than children from poor families. The correlation was undeniable. This wasn't spiritual correction. This was systematic theft disguised as religious practice. He brought his findings to the regional bishop in February 1487. The report was 127 pages long. It detailed financial irregularities across 17 parishes. It showed how local priests were deliberately targeting families with assets. It revealed that some priests were keeping detailed lists of which families to encourage toward Waldprobe based on property values. The bishop's response was not what Kramer expected. Instead of launching an investigation, he ordered Kramer's report sealed. He reassigned Kramer to a remote monastery. He sent letters to all parishes warning them that their financial practices were under scrutiny and needed to be regularized. The message was clear. Stop being so obvious about it. But Kramer had made copies of his report. Before leaving for his monastery assignment, he sent them to 3 other regional authorities. One ignored it. One sent it back with a warning to mind his own business. But the third, a secular magistrate named Wilhelm von Strasbourg, read it carefully, and he happened to be a father whose own daughter had undergone Waldprobe 2 years earlier. Wilhelm had money and power. He used both. He demanded a formal inquiry. When the church refused, he took his case to the imperial court. This was risky. Challenging church authority could end badly. But Wilhelm had the kind of grief-driven rage that makes men reckless. The case took 3 years to reach trial. During that time, the church tried everything to make it disappear. They offered Wilhelm money. They threatened him with excommunication. They suggested his daughter had genuinely needed correction, and his grief was clouding his judgment. He refused every compromise. The trial began in 1490. It technically focused on financial impropriety, not the morality of Waldprobe itself. Wilhelm was smart enough to frame it that way. He wasn't arguing the practice was wrong. He was arguing it had been corrupted by greed. The evidence was devastating. Witness after witness testified about property seizures. Families described how priests had encouraged them to consider Waldprobe, while simultaneously offering to manage the child's inheritance. Village elders admitted they'd received payments from the church for conducting rituals. The whole rotten system was exposed in methodical detail. On November 14, 1490, 3 priests were found guilty of fraud and corruption. Their punishment was being defrocked and exiled, not executed, not imprisoned, just removed from their positions. The church called this a victory for justice and reform. But the trial had a side effect nobody anticipated. It made Waldprobe legally vulnerable. If the practice had been corrupted by financial motives, courts could now question any specific case. Families began challenging historical Waldprobe judgments. They wanted their confiscated property back. They wanted their children's deaths acknowledged as murders. The church couldn't allow this. The financial liability was enormous. So in 1494, the regional church authority issued a decree. Waldprobe was officially discontinued. Not banned, not condemned, just quietly ended. The decree didn't say the practice was wrong. It said that, due to recent misunderstandings and corruptions, the traditional forest correction ritual will be suspended indefinitely pending review of proper procedures. The practice stopped. Not because anyone realized it was monstrous, not because authorities felt guilt about the hundreds or thousands of dead children. It stopped because it became legally and financially inconvenient. But the final horror of this story comes from what happened to the physical evidence. In 1502, church officials ordered a systematic cleanup of Waldprobe sites. They sent teams into the forests to remove any remains. Officially, this was about giving proper Christian burial to children who died during correction. Actually, it was about destroying evidence. The teams found more than anyone expected. One site near Freiburg contained the skeletal remains of at least 63 children, identifiable by size and red fabric fragments. Another site had 81. These weren't scattered remains from random deaths. They were concentrated in specific areas, the separation points, the places where mothers had left their children. The cleanup teams documented what they found in reports sent to the regional bishop. Those reports were kept in church archives until discovered by historians in 1891. The numbers were staggering. Across the regions where Waldprobe had been practiced, they estimated between 2,000 and 3,000 child skeletons were recovered and reburied. Most were buried in mass graves in church cemeteries. No markers, no names, no acknowledgement of how they died. Just hundreds of small bodies dumped together in consecrated ground, as if proper burial somehow absolved the system that had killed them. The final document in the church archive is a letter from the bishop dated 1503. In it, he expresses relief that the unfortunate matter had been resolved. He notes that with proper burial complete and the practice discontinued, there should be no further complications. He ends the letter with instructions to destroy all Waldprobe-related documents, except essential property transfer records. Most documents were destroyed, but enough survived to tell the story. Bits and pieces scattered across archives, personal letters, court records, property ledgers, audit reports, confession transcripts. Together, they reveal a system that operated for at least 140 years, killed thousands of children, traumatized countless families, and enriched the church through systematic murder, disguised as spiritual correction. And here's the final grotesque irony. The fairy tale survived. The story of Little Red Riding Hood became one of the most famous children's tales in the world. Generations of children have been told about the little girl in the red hood who goes into the forest and meets the wolf. The tale that was supposed to be a warning, a survival guide whispered from mother to child about the real dangers of being marked and sent away, became entertainment. The red hood that once meant death became a costume. The forest that devoured children became a storybook setting. The wolf that represented both animal predators and human monsters became a cartoon villain. We sanitized a horror story. We turned systematic child murder into a fairy tale with a happy ending. We let the real victims disappear into folklore while preserving only the sanitized version. The last confirmed Waldprobe ritual took place in 1521, nearly 30 years after the official discontinuation. A remote village, far from church oversight, sent a 12-year-old boy into the forest. He didn't return. When investigators finally reached the village years later, the elders claimed they didn't know the practice had been stopped. They'd been doing it the way it had always been done. That boy's name is lost to history. He's listed in a property transfer document only as the corrected one. His red hood was never found. His body was never recovered. He simply vanished into the German wilderness like thousands before him. And somewhere in those forests, if you know where to look, you can still find fragments of red fabric buried in the soil, faded, rotted, but still there. Physical evidence of a practice so monstrous that we turned it into a children's story rather than face what it really was. The tale that seemed innocent was never innocent at all. It was a memorial written in blood, a warning encoded in fairy tale language, a desperate attempt by traumatized mothers to give future children the survival knowledge their own children never had. Little Red Riding Hood isn't a story about stranger danger or listening to your parents. It's a story about what happens when communities decide some children are disposable, when religion becomes a cover for cruelty, when everyone knows what's happening but nobody stops it because the alternative means confronting their own complicity. The wolf in the story isn't the real monster. The real monsters were the people who put the red hood on the child in the first place. The ones who walked them into the forest. The ones who looked the other way. The ones who profited. The ones who, when finally caught, simply moved on to other forms of exploitation without ever admitting what they'd done. That's the real horror of the Wald probe. Not that it happened, but that it happened for generations, with full community participation, under religious authority, and when it finally ended, nobody was truly punished. The system just found other ways to sacrifice its children, and we turned it into a bedtime story.